I've gotten some weird requests in my time, but I think this one takes the cake, since Rebellion is a game, or Supremacy, for those of you in Europe, is a game that doesn't really have what most people would refer to as story. Now, it does have story. If this was just a purely blank slate, it wouldn't be the same kind of thing. It does have characters, locations, ideas, and concepts from the Star Wars EU, drawing from a huge variety of the EU, actually. We have Bevel Lemillisk, we have Thrawn, we have Luke, of course, all the main characters. The TIE Defenders are in this, all sorts of little details from the extended continuity of what used to exist for the EU are present here. So it's not like there isn't no story. And I feel like the inclusion of this flavor lore, for lack of a better way to put it, helps to elevate the game into otherwise what would be just kind of not that great, but still kind of an interesting game. But that's basically all I have to say about the story. So I hope you join me next time. No, I'm kidding, because I do like this inclusion. The person who requested this is actually a friend of mine. And I talked to him about it, and I said how grateful I was he picked this. And he was like, why? And I was like, because there's no lore in it. And he looked at me and he said, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. Because he understood. Obviously, I call myself the lore runner for good reason, but that there are two things in that, lore and runner, story, gameplay. And I feel like a lot of my viewers and a lot of people in general don't understand that I also care about gameplay and game design. I don't always have that much to say about a particular game, but that is something that very much interests me. And I've been studying game design and game development for about 20 years. No, 21 years now, as of this point. So first of all, the game does an astonishing number of things right. Like, in fact, really, I would say that I only have one major complaint about this game. Let's go ahead and get that out of the way first. That is the RTS sections. So every now and again, you have a space battle. And the space battles suck. They are not good. No music plays during it, which is in stark contrast to the rest of the game, where they have various different songs from the Star Wars original trilogy, which have been retouched up and looped over each other, so you have this continuous stream of Star Wars music, and different songs for different types of events. If a battle's about to happen, you'll hear they do a good job and an excellent direction of the usage of the music. You'll also notice that the music on both sides tends to vary a little bit, although both sides do still have some of the same general things. Also, on both sides we have the beep 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 or blah, 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 from either R2-D2 or an Imperial droid, and we have either 3PO or oh god, I can't remember his name. The Imperial droid. And the Imperial droid is of course suitably, you of course are pathetic and terrible, and it's all on you if we fail. Imperial intelligence. That's the word I hear so often. Like I can hear it. I can almost recite his speech in my head right now. Imperial intelligence, Imperial intelligence. But in both cases, the voice acting is actually pretty good, and also toggleable. In fact, you can toggle a huge amount of options with regards to how much feedback you get on virtually everything. You can toggle which types of events notify you, and which type of events are actually managed by either the droids or even announced by the droids. Sometimes you can make it so that they'll just pop up into the right side of the screen, so you'll see something there. But if you don't care about it, you don't have to look at it. One of the other things this game does is it makes it so that you can auto-manage certain parts of your galactic spanning empire if you choose to, by using the droid to manage production of certain facilities or troop maintenance, simple stuff like that, usual stuff. In general, you shouldn't do that, but it's nice that it's an option. I also love the shortcut system. One of the things this game does is it makes it so that anytime you click on, there's 3 layers. There's the galaxy map, there's the sector map, and then there's everything below that, which all kind of functions as the same layer. Planets, individuals, ships, I guess that's actually it. All 3 of those things all serve as the bottom layer. And you could shortcut either sectors or planets or ships or individuals or targets over on the left by just basically hitting the minimize button. So you can then pull it right back up and see, okay, how's this going like this? It's all very quick and convenient. In fact, I made the statement once before that the UI of this game takes some getting used to, but I'm not even sure that's really true anymore. Granted, I've played the hell out of this game. But having gone through it again for a fresh playthrough, there's a lot of convenience features, a lot of anti-frustration features, which is what a lot of people call that, throughout the course of the game to make sure that you have a lot of information at your disposal. In fact, probably the biggest downside for this game is the fact that it's resolution locked. And I don't mean like you can't stretch it. I mean the game itself is resolution locked. So if you stretch it, it's just stretching it out rather than increasing the overall game area you have. Which basically means you can have two windows up at a time, one on the left side of the screen and one on the right side of the screen. They basically take up the whole screen. That is an irritant, and that is a problem, and I'll admit that. A proper remake of this game would probably get rid of that and fix the RTS section. But anyways, I'm getting way off topic. Let's get back to the RTS section. So the lack of music is awful. That's the first problem. The second problem is, so you can give orders during the RTS segments, but I want you to imagine that you are, whatever commander you are, and you're giving orders to first-year cadets who haven't graduated, who haven't passed their first year yet. That's how the RTS section plays. The ships and fighters have no idea how to actually follow through on your orders, and in some cases literally won't. The graphics look terrible, like just actively terrible. The fighters are literally just 2D images that just kind of do this on the screen. The three-dimensional space is virtually unnecessary given how little it matters for the sake of the statistics. And this is the most important part: the actual stats of the ships are wrong. Just to put that as bluntly as I can. To put it to you this way. A single squadron of X-Wings can, under the right circumstances, take out a Star Destroyer. Now, yes, I know you could say that that's true in the movies as well, but to that I say bull. In fact, well, I suppose this is another thing to comment on, because this kind of works and kind of doesn't, but ultimately, based on everything I've read and studied, this was not by design. If you play as the Empire in this game, you are playing in hard mode. If you're playing as the Rebels, you are playing as easy mode. And I don't think that was intended. In fact, by all accounts, by all of the interviews and whatnot and the actual marketing spiels, it seems like it was supposed to be the other way around, that Empire was easy and Rebels were hard. Thing is, either the developers didn't really think about things or didn't really understand how their own game worked. Let's just look at a list here really quick, okay? So, the Rebels start off with weaker capital ships. But as I just told you, their fighters can actually take out capital ships. In fact, 2 escort carriers filled with X-Wings is a death squadron in this game. So the ship disparity that starts off isn't all that disparate, and it takes extremely little time for the Rebels to be able to tech up to the point where they have capital ships that are just as good as the Imperial ships. I mean, which, again, is a debatable thing, but a Mon Cal, or a decent assault frigate, is basically the equivalent of any Star Destroyer, and you're good to go. They also tend to be cheaper and quicker to build on the Rebel side, too. That leads me to the next point. Obviously the fighters themselves are stupidly strong. It takes the Empire forever to get fighters that can run to be able to do any kind of fighter screening. Lancer frigates kind of can, although they are still weaker than they should be, and you have to get all the way up to TIE defenders in order to be able to actually stand up against X-Wings and A-Wings. It's insane. The Rebels actually start off with a guaranteed ship researcher, so they can start researching ships immediately. The Rebels also start off with more, well, let's just say more useful characters. One of the things this game does, which is actually very awesome, is it has an agents system. More strategy games need this. What I mean by that is it has specialized units, like the recon droids or the saboteur teams, that you can build and train. And then it has the characters, which you can recruit. And each character has their own stats, and those stats can actually change and adjust over the course of the game based on events and based on, because there's some story scripted events, like Luke will eventually go to Dagobah, and he'll come back with Force abilities. And of course, the Force stat by itself basically functions as sort of a luck stat in gameplay. It basically improves the chance of everything going right, to put it into simple terms. And you can, there's a huge range of people that you can force train over time, and blah, 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 blah. But each of these stats allows people to undergo missions. There's diplomatic missions, there's research missions, there's recruitment missions, there's sabotage missions, there's assassination missions, capture missions, scouting missions, and I feel like I'm missing a few, but that's all the major ones right there. And each of these missions, and several people have commented that in the metagame, back when this was played a lot in Versus, it was all about the characters and the missions. The actual ships and fleets and conquests didn't mean anything. And unfortunately, that's true. The characters are just way too overpowered in general, and the missions are just too useful. You get a proper Doom squad of people going, and they can just start doing sabotage missions left and right. And a sabotage mission destroys things. Here's this planet I want to take. Well, they've got a 5 garrison requirement. They have 6 troops in there. Let's do 2 sabotage missions on those 2 troops. Those 2 troops are gone. They now only have 4 troops on a 5 troop garrison planet, which means they lose control of that planet and goes into revolt. Oh yes, there's also incite uprising missions. I forgot about that. So you can kind of see how. Oh, there's also there's troop training. There's troop research, ship research, and construct research. There's the 3 types of research you can do. So the characters are king, is what I'm trying to say. Getting back to the disparity problem, the rebels start off with all the best characters. The Empire has a few guaranteed starts, but the only ones that really matter for them are Vader and Palpatine. Palpatine has a passive leadership boost as long as he's on Coruscant, which means he should probably stay there, not on mission. Vader, well, he's a nice enforcer, but ultimately he's not really actually that useful. So instead, I ended up usually going for, I want to say Jerjerrod is one of the earliest ones, because he actually has a good diplomacy rating. But most of the Imperials don't have really good diplomacy ratings, so that means they're always going to be behind in the rep battle, which I'll talk about in a minute. Also, most of the characters they have that are more combat-oriented is really the only character advantage they have. And it's worth noting that the Empire have far less force sensitives than the Rebels do. The Rebels, by contrast, start off with multiple people who are guaranteed to be research people and extremely good diplomats, which leads into the rep battle. This is actually one of the things I do like about the game. Every, system in the entire galaxy has a reputation meter. And there's 3 types of reputation meters that can exist. There's your standard rep meter, which is what I'll be talking about predominantly. Then there's a neutral rep meter, and then there's a colonized rep meter. A neutral rep is for when you go out into the outer rim and you find a system that is neutral. People live there, people exist, or they have infrastructure, but they're not involved in the galactic civil war whatsoever. So you can actually go and sway them to your side or conquer them. And then there's the colonized one, which is exactly what it sounds like. A colonized planet is a planet you totally control. It is actually easy as pie to actually colonize. All you have to do is land a unit on that planet. Boom, it's colonized. Actually making it useful takes a lot more time and effort than that, but, It's also one of the reasons why Star Destroyers are... The only real use for Star Destroyers early game is to go colonizing. Anyways, so the first type is everywhere else has their standard rep meter. And even the neutral systems become standard rep meter once they've chosen one side or the other. It's very simple. Red is the Alliance, green is the Empire. Super simple. And if they're about in the middle, then they're neutral, functionally speaking. If they're leaning on one side towards the other, well, that provides a bunch of different benefits. If they get about, I'd say about 4/5 of one way or the other, that system will then declare and actually formally join the Rebel Alliance or the Empire, depending on which one's doing the diplomacy mission. So as you can already tell, diplomacy conquering is very much a thing in this game. And in fact, it's an extremely efficient, extremely cost-effective form of conquering. The only downside is it takes longer, because basically diplomacy missions just happen, and each time one concludes, it is either a success or a failure, changing the direction. And then you have to just keep doing it and keep doing it. It takes a very long time, many, many, many days to happen. But it is a near bloodless conquest, which just gets you everything just like that. And now they're on your side. By contrast, if you try to do a military invasion, their rep with you will go down for the fact that you did a military invasion, and then they will have a garrison requirement, which is dependent on your rep with them. Because, see, the rep determines more than just who owns a system. I keep wanting to call them planets. It determines more than let's just call them planets. It determines more than who owns the system. Or, God, I just said I was going to do that. It also determines how many troops are required to garrison it, how effective their production cycle is, how quickly all of their machines work, and... it also determines the success or failure of missions. So, for example, a planet that is super loyal to you is more likely to have certain missions happen, and is more likely to repel enemy missions to incite uprising, sabotage, kidnap, spy, etc. Make sense? So the rep is king. You really want as much rep on your side as can. And again, this is how the Empire is at a disadvantage, because they just have less diplomats, by a huge margin, actually. This also leads me to the fact that another thing that the Rebels start off with an advantage of is there's at least one system somewhere in the galaxy at the start, a lot of this is randomized, where the Rebels have supreme rep with an area. So it's a Rebel system which is being militarily occupied by the Empire. So that may sound like a good or a bad thing, but that's a bad thing for the Empire because that is now a powder keg waiting to happen. There is so much that can go wrong with a system that's loyal to the enemy that you have a military occupation in, right? So you have to immediately try and ensure that situation is being taken care of. Never mind the expense and effort being put into maintaining a troop regiment just as an occupying force. Because maintenance and upkeep is a thing in this game as well. Then you've got the fact that anytime Han Solo is moving with just other characters, not part of a fleet, he is presumed to be traveling on the Millennium Falcon. The Millennium Falcon is the fastest ship in the entire game. Now that may not sound like a thing, but travel time's a thing. So if you were to look at the actual galaxy map, you'll see, this sector to this sector. The game basically draws a line between those two, figures out the distance, and then calculates how long it'll take them to get there. And it takes a while to get from system to system, and a huge amount of time to get from sector to sector. Unless you're in the Falcon. And characters can move with the Falcon. So again, the character advantage is even more exacerbated by the fact that they can quickly respond with characters far faster than the Empire is even capable of doing. Then, there's the fact that certain characters are flagged as unkillable. This is admittedly actually kind of irritating, but the fact is there are certain characters you can't kill, no matter what you do. The worst you can do is injure them. Injury is a status effect on characters, which basically makes them more susceptible to certain types of actions, like being captured, and makes their stats go down when it comes to missions they do. And, also there's a healing mission, which only matters for injuring. And then, after you injure them, you can capture them. So you can't kill Vader and you can't kill Palpatine, and I believe that's it on the Empire side. Whereas on the Alliance side, you can't kill Mothma, Luke, Leia, Han, and Chewbacca, I believe, is the full list. You can kind of see how then the Alliance has more characters that they're just always going to have, because rescuing characters is actually a lot easier than it probably should be. That, of course, leads me to another thing that they have an advantage on, colonization. Colonization is actually a really big part of this game, because so what happens, I haven't even talked about the intel yet, the inner part of the galaxy is all known. Right? It's all mapped. It's all whatever. But if you're starting as the Empire, the entire outer rim is all unknown. You don't even know the names of the systems yet. It's just, there's a bunch of systems out there, so you have to send out scouts and ships to figure out what's even out there, whether they're worthwhile, whether you should colonize them, or whether you should convince the neutral system to be to your side, or whatever. The Rebel Alliance starts out with their base at Yavin already at the outer rim, just ready to go. And because they're already at the Outer Rim, remember I mentioned transit time, it's a lot quicker and easier for them to be able to access the Outer Rim and start colonizing earlier, especially if they start meeting neutral cities because they have better diplomats. All of this means that the rebels start off with the advantage, and then once they increase their tech level a little bit, they have even more advantages. It is easy mode, like it or not. Usually, back in the day when I would play with friends, I would usually play as the Empire. Not because, die rebel scum, but because I wanted the challenge of it. Because it was a challenge. And no, I didn't always win. So, gosh, what next? I want to comment on an idea that I've had several times, and I've never been dissuaded from this. Anybody who knows me knows I'm actually a big fan of grand strategy, although EU4 is probably my overall favorite game of that. I've enjoyed several grand strategy games in my life. But if you talk to most people about grand strategy games, they all talk about paradox games and nothing else. In my opinion, this is one of the first true grand strategy games, this one right here. I mean, think about it. So, it technically has turns in the same way that EU4 technically has turns. It has days. And the speed at which those days pass depends on a speed indicator, which you can change up in the upper right. By the way, as a quick aside, I wanted to do more research on the making of this game, but there was none. Like, I couldn't find a significant amount of information on the making of this game. I have an extremely strong impression that some of the developers who worked on this game after this company, which I've never even heard of and didn't even have any information on it either, shut down, went over to work at Paradox. It's just a theory of mine because this game plays a lot like a Paradox game. It's got the days, it's got the speed, it's got maintenance and resources, and just, again, the whole thing is relatively time-based, and there's characters, and there's missions, and there's planets that you have to maintain. It's just, everything about this feels like a Paradox grand strategy game, just Star Wars and also awesome. Anyways, so I tend to think of this as a grand strategy rather than a typical 4X. What's funny is when this game came out, it was billed as an RTS. Technically, Oh, yeah, I suppose I should say you can also promote people to admiral, general, or commander because everyone has a specific leadership staff, and some of them have specific leadership staffs regarding certain things. Generals improve the troops, commanders improve the fighters, admirals improve the ships. Pretty basic. It also follows the command and conquer style of construction. To put this into simplistic terms, these are all made up numbers. If you have one construction yard, it'll take you 100 days to make something. If you have two, it takes you 50. If you have three, it takes you 33. If you have four, you get the point. It takes you 25, etc., etc., etc. So you're very much encouraged to not have any given planet that can make everything, but rather to hyper-specialize any given planet. In fact, in general, the first few hours, turns, I don't know what to call it, of play, usually, at least in my experience, usually involves completely undoing whatever you have set up on your planets and trying to set up like a construction planet, and then a ship construction planet, or a shipyard planet, and then a ground troop planet, and so forth and so on. But you also have to keep track of your resources. There's not actually money in this game, which I actually like, as weird as that may sound, given the nature of the gameplay. Instead, what you have to deal with is infrastructure. So you've got raw materials, you've got refined materials, and then you've got infrastructure. I forget the game term for it, but that's what I think of it as, because that's what it is. The way it works is like this. All sorts of planets have different stats, but the three stats that matter most is how many mining spots they have, and, well, okay, the two stats that matter most for this are how many mining, how many raw resources they have, and how much infrastructure capacity they have, okay? Those are their energy slots. So mining slots you can build mines on them to produce raw resources. Energy slots you can build anything on. Every mine also takes up an energy slot, by the way. So you always have a finite number of buildings you can build on any given planet, and you always have to keep that in mind when it comes to constructing your setup. And let me tell you this, it takes literally in the years range to build certain ships and stuff in this, kind of like EU4. And so you want to have as many stacked constructions as possible. In some cases, I actually had shipyards that had 9 shipyards on a single planet just to make sure I could build ships as quickly as possible. So, having said all that, what you have to maintain, though, is a balance, because mines produce raw resources, which is actually useless to you. A raw resource actually accomplishes nothing by itself. You need to refine it. A refinery, of course, also takes an energy slot. Every refinery will then take some of those raw resources and turn them over into refined resources, which is what everything actually costs to build. Also, every mine-refinery combo produces infrastructure. That's basically your food cap, to equate it to what most other strategy games do. So you can't actually go over your food cap. You need those there in order to make that. And if you're paying attention, that's kind of a finite resource, because you can always get more mines and more, and you can always keep charging out more resources into refined resources, but you can never get more of this. Like if you had because there's a finite number of energy slots in the galaxy, and thus a finite of combinations between mines and refineries. So you do have a sort of very large food cap in the large scale sense of the word. Managing these three things and making sure that you have resources, refined resources, infrastructure, energy slots, and make sure you're defending your stations as well is also a very important thing, because, as I mentioned earlier, even though characters are king, ships, troops, and fighters, as well as defense installations, do actually affect the success rate of missions. In other words, if you decide to go hog wild on characters, that's fine, but that basically means your door's wide open for the enemy to come in with their characters, so you can't ignore your defenses. This does lead to some games I've had in the past where basically all the ships and troops and material that was produced was purely for a defensive purpose, not counting the scouting and colonizing fleet which would go around. One thing I actually found out when I was going through this playthrough, because I was looking up other people's strategies for the game to see if there's anything I missed, is that apparently, two things actually I should say. One, X-Wings can bombard planets. To explain what I mean by that, every ship has certain stats attributed to them. Most fighters have fighter-related stats, and most capital ships have capital ship-related stats. Now, there's a little bleed over, like the Lancer frigates do have fighter stats to be able to fight fighters. X-Wings have several capital ship stats. It's why they're so ridiculously overpowered. Now, yes, I know the X-Wing is actually stupidly overpowered in lore, and that's been an aggravation to me for years. But the fact is, they have several capital ship stats, so they can go toe-to-toe with capital ships, and that also means they can bombard planets, which means the X-Wing is king, is what I'm trying to get to. But the other thing I learned is that you can actually keep bombarding energy squares. And so I mentioned how each planet has like a number of energy squares, and that's how much buildings they can hold. You can just bombard that down till that's down to 0 if you want to. That's horrible, by the way, and that's terrible, but if all you're interested in is winning rather than conquering, then I suppose that makes a degree of sense, because you have just ensured that no one will ever get to use that planet for anything ever. It is now a worthless planet, because you can't build anything there. No, and I just want to stress anything: construction yards, shipyards, troop training facilities, the mines, the refineries, the defense shields, orbital cannons. All of that takes up energy slots. Nothing. What the hell? I suppose I should talk about the Death Star, too. You can build a Death Star. Don't. The Death Star's so useless. It is such a waste of everything. I suppose that is, again, in canon and makes sense in lore. But the Death Star... Okay, so let me explain the Death Star for you. Because the way the Death Star works is, first of all, it takes an absolutely insane amount of resources, the refined resources, and infrastructure to build. You will not be able to build a Death Star for some time, even though you have the plans to do so pretty much right off the bat. And also, obviously, only the Empire can build a new Death Star. You can actually build multiple Death Stars, too, but that's just reaching insane levels of territory right there. Anyways, after you have successfully managed to build a Death Star, now you have to defend it, because the enemy, as the rebels, will always know where it is and will always constantly try to go after it. One X-Wing squadron can destroy the Death Star. Now again, I know, Battle of Yavin, but in gameplay terms, it means it is really easy to lose a Death Star. Because X-Wings get the special trench run mission on the Death Star, which by default has a high chance of succeeding. So unless you have a very high fighter screen, it's actually very high chance that they could just send a single X-Wing squadron out and blow up your Death Star. Even with a fighter screen, they may still succeed. So keep that in mind. Now, the Death Stars do have a passive function, which is actually very nice. So the game's divided up into sectors, right? How many sectors are in the game depends on the size of the game map you make. Each sector has a number of systems, and that's just the general gist of that. A lot of things that happen are sector-wide. So in other words, let me give you an earlier example. Let's say you bombard a planet. Well, doing so lowers your rep, with the rep bar, for the entire sector, but not the whole galaxy. So a lot of stuff is affected on a sector-wide level. Any sector that has the Death Star in it has 3 effects immediately. First of all, your rep with every system in that sector goes up, which I find funny. Like, oh god, please don't use it on us. Second of all, the actual garrison requirements across the board, in addition to the rep change, goes down. And finally, well, it also means that everyone knows exactly where it is, but that's an unrelated thing, I suppose I should say. But okay, I'll talk about that in a second, because I haven't talked about the intel side of things yet. So those are the 2 main things, the rep change and the garrison requirements, okay? That's the only use of the Death Star right there. You can destroy a planet. If you do so, that planet is gone, and it will never come back. If you destroy a planet, your rep goes down for every system in the entire game. All of them. Yeah. It is, in general, in the meta, back when I used to play this in PvP stuff, the only accepted time to use a Death Star to destroy a planet was if you had found the Rebel headquarters and just blow it up. It was usually worth losing that rep gain across the galaxy in order to destroy wherever the Rebel headquarters are. Because both sides have their own win conditions, which you can set up at the beginning of the game. These win conditions generally involve taking the enemy capital. The rebel capital can move. It's actually an action it has. The Empire capital is obviously Coruscant. And you have to capture and take several key members of the opposing side. Vader and Palpatine, Luke and Mon Mothma, that kind of a thing. So taking out the rebel base and ensuring that it can never move again is actually quite useful. Oh yeah, by the way, the rebel base also provides a rep boost anywhere it's at and gives a rep negative anytime it moves away from a planet. That's another little side rep thing. There's actually a lot of complexity and detail to this game, which I'm not going into full depth on, because I don't want to bore you. I do want you to play this game. It's a good game. Let's talk about the intel, and I guess that'll be the last thing. I'm looking at my notes here. I think that's the last thing I really have to share. So I love the intel system, because basically you don't have proper intel. Let me put it to you this way. You know how, let me parallel the EU4. Let's say you're playing EU4, and as you're playing, you notice that there's this 20,000 stack over in the Ottomans, and they're just marching off to war to Crimea. And you can see that, because that's how the game works. The fog of war basically allows you to see anything within your sphere of information. And that makes a degree of sense, but in this game, your sphere of information is a lot more limited. Intel on the core worlds is usually generally up to date because of the information infrastructure there. Although it's not always completely up to date, and on any planet you do not own, the information you get there is actually a snapshot. So, for example, let's say that you see a rebel base and you see you look at the information you have, and then you see Han Solo, who has a light speed indicator on, which means he is traveling to that planet. Aha! So you can set missions for Han Solo on, I don't know, Ord Mantell or whatever, right? But when you get there, Han may not be there because that was a snapshot. In other words, that information is now out of date by the time it actually happens. This is then exemplified with the Outer Ring, where the only information you have in the Outer Rim territories is the actual planets you hold. So you have to constantly be running spying missions, which you actually get probe droids in order to do, as well as trying to expand your sphere of influence in order to get as much concrete information as possible. In my opinion, this is a good thing. I could see why it would irritate some people, and it's probably one of the biggest things I have to mention for people who want to play this game, because that snapshot perspective isn't really all that well conveyed in the game. But once you understand it, a lot of things kind of lock into place. It's like, okay, when our droids last scanned this system, this is what was happening here. Now, this information is officially out of date the moment we get it, and will continue to get more out of date the further on we go. But this is what we knew was there at this point in time. So in other words, having a small fleet of probe droids ready to go at a moment's notice is generally considered to be a good thing. It's also worth noting that probe spying missions basically can't fail. But they also can only give you not only the snapshot, but not all of the full details of what's happening there. So that's something worth keeping in mind as well. I guess that's everything. I do like this game. It was fun to play it again. I've actually streamed this game before, and I'd love to stream it again sometime, just for fun. But for now, I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts on the gameplay of this game. I'll see you next time, guys.